We are lucky enough this morning to have an amazing panel with us who are bringing together a real breadth of experience and perspectives. And I think that's something that's really important in moving forward discussions on climate finance. Today, we're being joined by Rob Moore, who is the head of finance at the COP unit at the Cabinet Office. He leads the team working on international support issues and was a senior member of the UK presidency team overseeing the negotiations at COP26. He's negotiated on climate finance issues for the European Union at a number of the previous COPs, while actually working in the UK's International Climate Finance Strategy team. And he's previously held a number of domestic energy and climate roles in both DEC and the Treasury. We're also being joined by Ryan Phillips, who is the COP26 delegate for St Kitts and Nevis. So he's actually studying for an MSc in climate change at UCL, but actually worked as a water engineer at the main water utility back in St Kitts and Nevis, where he designed and executed all the major engineering works and supervised all the daily operations. So he has got a real understanding of the importance of the impact that climate change is having and what's needed to actually address it. He was also part of the COP26 delegation representing St Kitts and Nevis, which is a small island nation in the Caribbean. We're also joined by Krista Tukiainen, who is the head of market intelligence at the Climate Bonds Initiative. Krista oversees the global research pipeline at the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is working to mobilize the bond market for climate change solutions. So she oversees the production of data and analysis, which is intended to help investors allocate capital to climate solutions, but in a way that follows science-based definitions. She worked as a consultant at the University of Cambridge's Centre for Sustainable Development and had held an ESG advisory role at London-based boutique firm Longevity Partners. Dr. Jessica Omukuti is a research fellow on inclusive net zero for the Oxford Net Zero Initiative and a COP26 fellow for climate finance. She actually explores how inclusivity can be embedded into net zero policies and practices in the global south. Her role as an ESRC COP26 fellow is where she focuses on the delivery of climate finance for adaptation, specifically using the Green Climate Fund as a case study. Her research expertise is on climate justice and equity, climate finance, climate change adaptation, and just transitions in the global south. And she's also worked at the Green Climate Fund, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from Jessica today. She was also one of the co-authors of the COP26 Universities Network briefing on climate finance. So if you're looking to explore the topic further, I actually urge you to take a look. It's called Aligning Climate Finance for an Equal and Sustainable Net Zero Future. And we'll actually be sending around a link to that later today. Today's discussion is incredibly timely for a number of different reasons. We actually can't ignore the geopolitical implications of our reliance on fossil fuels. And what we're looking at today in Ukraine is very closely interconnected with what's going on with our reliance on fossil fuels. We need to think more closely about the impact of short-sighted actions on the long-term global future. Last year, we saw COP26, which did manage to keep 1.5 alive, but the release of AR6 on Monday has made clear that we're already suffering the impacts of climate change and that many of those changes are irreversible. There's clearly a need for massive amounts of investment in mitigation and of course in adaptation to the changes taking place in the climate. Today, around roughly 40% of the world's population is now considered highly vulnerable to climate change. Floods, fires and droughts are becoming everyday occurrences, and 100-year storms are occurring with far greater frequency. It's not even the devastation of extreme weather events that's the real concern, though. It's the wider and longer term impacts, challenges to infrastructure and food security, health and welfare, the supply chain, basically overall economic stability. These are all things we're going to need to come to terms with. Yet while there is growing mainstream acceptance of the need to act decisively on climate change, there are still huge challenges in the deployment of climate finance. And that's from the level of finance available, to the type of finance and the cost of capital. Developed nations have already failed to provide the pledge of 100 billion in annual climate finance by 2020. Now it looks like that goal is going to be achieved by or before 2023, but the failure to fulfill a pledge, it does undermine already contentious relationships. We know that climate finance has been increasing over the last decade, but actually in the last couple of years, it's begun to slow, and that's even before we factor in the impact of the pandemic. According to the Climate Policy Initiative's research, annual growth in climate finance actually fell from 24% to 10% in the year between 2017-18 and 2019-20. And they actually project we need to increase annual climate finance by about 600% if we're going to hit our 2030 objectives. Now, there is still an opportunity for effective action. The private sector is making great strides in its adoption of an ESG lens on investment, but despite its size and rapid growth, it's still a sector that needs to mature. And it has its own problems with clarity and definitions and transparency. Much of the focus in finance is beginning to coalesce around this idea of net zero, but basically since the IPCC's net zero report in 2018. But the concept has become mainstream. And it's providing a target which actually we can set frameworks around, we can look and build roadmaps, and we can start to measure performance. The thing about climate finance is it's not just a financial issue. It's one of perspectives and politics and ability to act. That's why I'm so excited that we're going to be hearing from our speakers today. So first of all, I'd like to turn to Rob Moore. Rob, could you kick us off with an update on UK government priorities on climate finance? Because obviously the UK is still leading the COP26 presidency in the lead up to COP27.
Yep, thanks, Felicia, and thanks for the introduction. So I would sort of conceive of where we're going now following Glasgow in sort of a couple of buckets, which I think just for clarity, it's helpful to distill. But throughout, I think there's a sort of theme of trying to get on with doing things now and get things flowing, whilst also trying to make headway in some of those longer term structural issues that are not going to be readily resolved in a sort of very short period. So it starts with acting on what was agreed in Glasgow, and just for those that, you know, I think the finance outcomes at Glasgow, I think, were never going to be as ambitious as everybody would like them to be, but generally the response that we've had from developing country partners, from civil society observers, has been, you know, that actually, from a practical sense, it probably was quite a big step forward on previous COPs, and to bring to light what those aspects were. There was, you know, I take your point on the 100 billion goal not being met, and, you know, it's deeply regrettable that it wasn't. We spent a lot of time in the run-up to COP speaking to other donor countries to get them to increase their pledges. It was sort of a leader level issue for us, and so I think the reticence that that was shown by the donors was helpful in rebuilding some of that trust, combined with the pledges. So I think, you know, it's all about implementation now and actually doing what's been said, and that's when the trust actually gets rebuilt. But I think, you know, the change in tone from a sort of what can often be quite a defensive discussion to more one of, yeah, you know, the goal was missed. But it will be hit. It will be hit late, and the sort of apologetic, sort of sincere tone, I think, wasn't lost on, and is, as someone who's been in these discussions for a long time, it was new, and I think was helpful. I think that the sort of the tone of discussion is equally, not equally important, but is also very important. So there was the sort of the delivery plan. There were a range of commitments from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero on sort of private sector side. And there was also, for the first time, a specific goal on adaptation finance to double adaptation finance from 2019 levels by 2025. And for each of those, I think, you know, the focus now pivoting from the goal itself to the implementation is going to be really important. And so what needs to be done in each of those three buckets, on the 100 billion as a whole, on adaptation finance increase, and on sort of showing that these private sector alignment commitments that sound very weighty and substantive are material and are reaching where they need to go. So I think there's the sort of showing that what has been promised will be delivered. That's not to say that everything that's promised is sufficient. There's, of course, always more to be done. And then, so I think there's taking forward those aspects. Then separately, I think there's taking those very intangible commitments that are just sort of very broad and, you know, quantified, but quite difficult to actually see discretely how they're carried out in practice, and trying to work with a couple of specific countries in specific contexts to actually drive, whether it's ambition or increased resilience and more adaptive development pathways. And that takes the form of either, you know, we're building on some of the work that was done with South Africa with the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and sort of speaking to some other countries, sort of if there's things that are in a similar space, not necessarily to the full extent, but this notion of working closely with multiple donors and the private sector and the government themselves and local actors in a very specific context, rather than these quite nebulous commitments that often are quite difficult to translate into action on the ground, unless there is that translation action as well. And same goes for the Access to Climate Finance Task Force that the UK government launched last year, specifically looking at working with vulnerable countries to ensure that the finance that's promised can be accessed by them, rather than being something. And I know Jessica's worked with the Green Climate Fund. This is often one of the sort of big issues there. It's the money's there, might not be enough, but there is money there, and can you actually access it, or are there sort of bureaucratic reasons that can be quite difficult, and what of those can you remove versus which of them are sort of more difficult to remove for various reasons. So there's a lot of work going on there. And then finally, that's the getting on with things in the meantime side of things. But there's also, which I think is quite important and deserves some visibility, is what we also launched at COP26 was the discussion on the new finance goal to replace the 100 billion. So the 100 billion comes from 2009, before the rise of sustainable finance, very different backdrop of economics on climate. And we're living in a very different world now, and we've now got, I think there's nobody that works in finance or climate and development that would say that a simple finance mobilization goal like the 100 billion is perfect. And we've actually got a chance now to have a real discussion over the next few years on how do these different aspects of the financial landscape sit together, and what does that tell you about the sort of goal that you should and could have to reach the ambition of Paris. And I think there's a whole, almost a wipe the slate clean, what is the right sort of goal for us, and really trying to make that an inclusive, multi-stakeholder discussion to set the global incentives right from 2025, so that we're all pushing towards a singular goal that sort of works for everyone. I'll stop there, and obviously happy to pick up in the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob, very much appreciated. Ryan, I think, given the fact that Rob was talking very much about the change in tone, it would be really interesting to get your perspective as a representative for St. Kitts and Nevis on why, climate finance is so important for small island states and other vulnerable countries.
Thanks so much for your introduction, Felicia. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today. As you would have mentioned, I was born and raised in St. Kitts and Nevis, which is the smallest sovereign nation in the Western Hemisphere. So the ongoing debates surrounding climate change, and in particular climate finance, are very personal to me. Also, having worked as a civil servant in one of the most vulnerable sectors, I would have witnessed firsthand the severity of impacts currently being felt in my country and in other small island developing states. This sort of drove me to realign my career path to do everything that I can to fight for our future. And when I say fight for our future, I mean this quite literally. I'm sure many of you would have seen the IPCC's most recent publication, where they basically re-emphasize the point that we're running out of time. And since then, I saw an article on CNN, and it was titled "Delay Means Death." And this resonated with me because this is the reality for myself and for millions of persons living in small island developing states. What is most unfortunate about this is that our fate isn't in our hands. We are at the mercy of developed nations who have created this crisis, and we need them to do what is necessary to save our country and the planet as a whole. Although there have been small steps made towards cutting emissions and mobilizing finance, I think the action is far from enough. I'm happy that Rob spoke pretty positively about, meeting the pledge that was made in 2009. It's been 11 years and there is now this mistrust between the developing countries and the developed nations that would have made that pledge. So I'm happy to hear that. And I also want to mention that these developed countries also have the capacity, you know, to adapt and mobilize their own resources. But because of the lack of finance in small island developing states, we aren't that lucky, you know? So that's why now it's more important than ever that we look to these countries to double adaptation finance and increase funding for small island developing states and other climate vulnerable regions. Thank you. I'll end there for now.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very much appreciated. Now, and I think actually one of the things that your comments raise is, as Rob talked about, there is this issue of a new target looking at all of the different elements of the finance spectrum and how they can actually work together to look at finance in a different way. And I think there needs to be a greater understanding of how the private finance sector works. And I think, Krista, it would be brilliant if you could actually give us your perspective on the private sector mobilization of climate finance and the impact perhaps that you think COP26 did or didn't have on the wider financial landscape, and what things you think might help shift private finance more towards a sort of climate addressing focus.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Felicia, for that introduction and also for having me on the panel. I'm not sure how much folks in the audience know about Climate Bonds Initiative, or CBI, as an organization, but as was mentioned, we are a UK-based registered charity working on mobilizing money through the biggest capital market segment of all, the bond market, which is $100 trillion of outstanding volume at the moment. So that's a lot of money and a lot of zeros that goes into financing the day-to-day operations of not only private sector entities, non-financial and financial corporates, but also governments, local governments, agencies across the world. So I'll come at this by saying we think about climate finance as a much broader concept than perhaps in some of the kind of UN system conversations. I appreciate that there have to be boundaries around the nomenclature, but if I can offer sort of a message of optimism on the private climate finance side, just in green bonds, which are essentially conventional bonds, but with a ring-fenced use of proceeds, as we say, so they have to finance predetermined eligible projects and assets that should be based on climate definitions and climate science. That market segment didn't exist 15 years ago. It was started, catalyzed by some of the development banks, European Investment Bank and the World Bank in 2007 and 8. It has since grown to 1.7 trillion of issued volume from more than 5,000 entities all over the world. And the good news is that it's been growing quicker and quicker in recent years, and the actual average annualized growth rate is something like 93%. So, and we've also, as part of that group, seen 22 governments, sovereign governments, issuing green bonds to finance real climate-related expenditures, both in mitigation as well as adaptation. So this is a fairly well-established mechanism by now, and I would say definitely much more of the same is needed. When you contrast that 100 trillion to that 1.7, it's clear that we're still very much at the start of this process. But I think in part due to the developments that we saw at COP26 with the famous GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero commitments from sort of conventional capital providers to facilitate net zero, being kind of ready to invest with caveats, which we can get into over the course of the panel discussion. We're seeing a watershed moment now. So we're forecasting another doubling of volume and about 5 trillion of green finance, as it were, climate finance, mobilized through just this sole mechanism by as quickly as 2025. Now, we still have work to do in understanding what the real impact is, of course. Some of the bond market is really used for refinancing assets that already exist, and that can be an issue in the conversation around how additional are these investments in generating both mitigation and sort of new adaptive capacity or resilience impacts in the real economy. But I would still say that we're kind of most of the way there in terms of mechanisms that are proven and very accepted by investors. We've seen relatively constant and consistent evidence of issuers, so the folks that are asking for the money, getting a cheaper cost of funding when they issue under the green label. So I'll stop there for now, but I'm happy to delve into any of those topics deeper over the course of the panel.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Krista. Jessica, perhaps you could share your perspective on the state of climate finance post COP26, especially in relationship to adaptation in terms of the challenges and priorities that we face, because I think there is the issue that Krista raised that bond finance, although it's proved incredibly successful in the private sector for raising finance for the climate, it's a very specific mechanism and it's not always necessarily as easily used for adaptation. So it'd be really great to get your perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Felicia. So I work, my work is on net zero. I work at looking at how net zero can be inclusive, whether net zero can be inclusive. And one of the things we're realizing is that the net zero agenda has been able to rally quite a lot of actors behind it, much more than the Paris Agreement even did. And so the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is kind of a very good example for that. We're seeing much more interest in financing climate action that has a net zero tag on it. And this is quite interesting. But then that means that there is a risk that the focus on mitigation will kind of overpower the focus on adaptation. And this is one of those kind of a very real thing that could happen over the next few years. And this will determine how much finance is allocated to adaptation and mitigation. But net zero itself has the potential to also restructure how the financial system works and how much it pays attention to both. And so it's kind of a risk, but also an opportunity. And one of the things that is important moving forward is ensuring that these new flows of finance from both private sector, but also from governments that are making net zero commitments, address the regional distribution inequalities that have been there before. For example, so not just ensuring that there's more finance for adaptation, we need to make sure that places that have received less finance in the past are able to get the finance that they need. And for example, if the GFANS is able to allocate the 130 trillion that they promised at COP26, we need to make sure that that finance also goes to countries that need that money to make the transitions to net zero, not just in the present, but also for the future. And I see international climate finance mechanisms like the GCF being really critical in this case. As a first step is making sure that systems in the developing world have the capacity to identify new sources of finance, but also to engage with finance sources to ensure that money gets to those places. But it's also more than that, getting them to generate pipelines of projects that can be funded by these private sector finance sources. And further than that, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, can be very critical in de-risking financial investments. And so we use public finance to create blended finance mechanisms that can still direct funding to developing countries. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, I think one of the things you brought up there was this idea that the introduction of the net zero concept has actually sort of mobilized an awful lot of different actors behind it. And I think this is a question I'd really like everyone to give me an answer to. But one of the things we're always talking about is the difficulty in the siloization of the way in which we approach the climate problem. Is it nature? Is it climate? Is it carbon? Is it equality? There's all these different questions. So I'm just really interested in the panel's perspective on the best way forward, the best way to motivate all the different actors. And in that case, I'm talking business, I'm talking countries, I'm talking NGOs, I'm talking individuals. Do you think it is framing it around risk, as has proved very successful in the business community? Is it about social justice? Is it about really basic stuff like new approaches to accounting? So who would like to start off with their thoughts on that? I think I'm just going to start backwards. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think South Africa's example really gives us a very good, a good model. Finding shared interests. It's finding core benefits for actions. I mean, if I can give you apples and you need apples, let's do that exchange. And it's kind of understanding that places need money to engage in transitions to net zero, and there's countries that need to invest to engage in transitions to net zero. And when we understand the shared goals and how our goals can create core benefits, that will at least start to kind of dissolve the silos, because at the moment we seem to be thinking in ways that action in this sector can only happen in that sector, or in that strand can only happen in that strand. And so we need to kind of think about core benefits across sectors, but also across regions, how resilience in the developing world can contribute towards reductions in emissions in the long term. And I think that's kind of really important, because the Paris Agreement gives that flexibility for developing countries to develop their sustainable development agendas. And so understanding that as soon, the quicker that developing countries can get to the sustainable development goals, the quicker we can get to net zero. That is kind of a shared goal, and that can drive future action and dissolve silos.
I love that. And I really love the fact you bring in the SDGs, because I think that's growing in importance and saliency outside the policy world. People are really beginning to understand that none of these solutions can be achieved without really trying to achieve across all of them. Krista, can I ask you to give me your thoughts on that question?
Sure. I'll potentially sort of divert a little bit, because there was a question from an anonymous attendee saying the green bond market has self-evidently failed to deliver climate mitigation. I think this relates to some of the things that still need to happen. I disagree with the premise that it's a self-evident failure. I would urge you to just look at the tiny share that it still comprises of conventional finance everywhere, even if we just look at the bond market, not even venturing to other financing mechanisms. And of course, appreciating that not everybody's going to go out and issue bonds and raise capital in that way, but they are pretty big. The other, the success side of that story, I think, is the ability or the kind of emergence of a clear mechanism to signpost and also report on the impact that you're having with actual financing that is being raised, and also spurring things like taxonomies, right? So one of the things that we're going to have to agree on between private and public finance entities is, what does good look like? And I think we're getting to that conversation in a real way now that this is becoming legislated in Europe, but it's not just Europe, and it can't be a Eurocentric conversation, as Jessica's just pointed out. Of course, the important bit is to make sure that the finance flows to where it's needed the most, and these classification systems and the kind of real hard conversation about what good looks like in each given context is being had in places ranging from Colombia to the ASEAN nations and many places in between, South Africa as well. So that's one thing. Then there's a need to have access to and be able to share good data. We have more data than we've ever had before, but most of it is useless. We're going to get into materiality concepts, I'm sure, at some point, given the kind of conversations where it's flowing. We as an organization, and certainly myself personally, would advocate for getting rid of the concept of ESG completely, because it is doing nothing but hindering progress on this front for actual climate outcomes. So moving away from that and the single kind of conventional accounting concept of materiality, finance decision useful points for a company, let's say, for example, without thinking about what that company or that entity's impact is on climate issues. So it has to be both ways, and it has to be risk and opportunity. And then, of course, ideally, we price in all the impacts so that there's kind of levers of change. So I guess that final point relates to good policy. Market failures are market failures. They're going to be there if we don't have the appropriate regulatory frameworks in place. And I think these have to work in tandem. And this is maybe a little bit of a superficial answer, but we've already started to see some good examples of how this can happen, where, and I'm going to use the EU as an example again, because it's the most comprehensive and potentially replicable way to do this, to say, I'm going to set out what good looks like in my taxonomy, and then I'm going to regulate the disclosures from both the companies as well as the investors, and not just within that jurisdiction, but anybody that has exposure to that. I was in North America for 2 weeks just now talking to investors there, and they are gearing up to do this as well, because they have to. So that's how I think those are some of the points that we still need to work out to make sure that this kind of happens as quickly as it really needs to happen.
And I think that's a really interesting point to bring up with regard to materiality and with regard to ESG, and also with regard to the EU and the taxonomy, because obviously the taxonomy has been attacked somewhat for including gas and nuclear. But the reality is the European approach is incorporating the impact of operations on nature and on climate, which means it has a very different approach and a very different expectation from the traditional financial only accounting frameworks. So I think that's a really great response in terms of helping the understanding of what we need to look for in terms of accounting frameworks, and the fact that we need to look beyond what we actually have on the table at the moment. But I'd be really interested, I mean, Ryan, do you have any thoughts on what you think is the most effective way of bringing people together to move the climate finance discussion forward?
I think my response to this will be pretty short. Silos definitely need to be removed. My short experience in this field, I've seen that everything seems to be isolated, but the impacts of climate change are going to be widely felt. It's going to impact all sectors. It's going to compound the issues that you would have mentioned, such as social inequality, etc. So what I would suggest is that we definitely have to work together in whatever way possible, whether it is public-private sector relations, just to ensure that we can have a more sustainable future.
Fantastic, thank you. Rob, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it speaks to, and I raised a point in opening remarks around linking the intangible with the tangible, and sort of these sort of notional big numbers and big, grand commitments with actual things that are happening on the ground. And I think that that's the point at which these things need to be brought together. And the political economy of climate change is such that we're always going to have standalone goals and targets, but they need to be implemented as part of sort of national development strategies and planning. So I think there's, and I thought, the South Africa example, as raised a moment ago, is also very pertinent, because there you have lots of actors working together to translate these notional commitments and groundswell into something which is a bit more concrete. So I think a lot of it comes down to that, and a lot of it, I think, will need to rely on, I think there's a mutual synergy between sort of private sector commitments, if they have real integrity, and national planning, if it is done with confidence and properly integrated and gives a degree of certainty. There are then still, of course, a huge amount of development issues that arise out of that, whether it's small island developing states with capital flight issues, or whether it's, simply that in some places it is still more capital intensive, even though the cost of renewables have fallen. And that's where the sort of concessional finance comes in from the developed country donors and philanthropy, etc. So I think it's how these different bits sit together. And I'm going to be a bit repetitive and also plug that, luckily we now have 3 years to set a goal which is fit for purpose in doing some of those things and having the right conversations. So, thanks.
And I'm going to come back to you on this, because I think this is a really, really important point. And I love the fact that you're talking about this new target and the need to bring things together, because one of the things that is always challenging is managing policy frameworks within the wider context. So I'm thinking about the fact that, we've got big commitments within the UK, for example, about climate finance, but at the same time, we've got subsidies given to fossil fuels. So, there's a lot going on. I think the latest meeting in the Convention on Biological Diversity is happening very soon. And I think, do you have any thoughts on ideas of how we can bring together the different parts of government to look at the sort of bigger picture, the overall picture, rather than, because it's one thing to talk about silos in terms of impact, and that we need to address emissions, and we need to address water, and we need to address social justice, and we need to, et cetera, but how do we go about doing that on a national level and actually implementing these national priorities for development in the way that you're discussing?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and avoid straying too much into domestic politics.
Yes, sorry. Take the
no,
off the table altogether.
One of the detrimental aspects of being a government official is you need to tread, if it's not your area, quite carefully. And a couple of years ago, I probably could have had that conversation. But in the more generic sense, I think what's really important is that the right people are having the right conversations. And so, you know, a lot of the decisions that will determine whether or not climate actions can be financed will be had by finance ministries or ministries of planning in the developing world, or, you know, and it's ensuring that there are cross-government forums within governments. And we've actually, I think actually the UK's establishment of, you know, the Committee on Climate Change to have that independent accounting, and some of the developments that you saw in Germany with the climate committee over the last couple of years, I think that is happening in some places as individual exemplars, and it's making that more widespread. So I mean, we have some climate finance programming in countries like Colombia, which is targeted at, you know, upskilling the capability of finance ministries, for instance. But then it's also doing that in international fora, and, you know, ensuring that these discussions are being had at leader level and at finance ministry level, rather than only amongst environment ministries, because that's where the levers sit. So obviously, we could have a long debate of whether anything that's done in a communique actually leads to things happening in practice. But fundamentally, if those are the tools you have, those are at least the corridors and the rooms in which you need to be having that conversation. And I think that is moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think your comment that the important thing is for the right people to be having the right conversations is fascinating, because there is no question that the shift from the Environment Ministry to the Finance Ministry is a fundamental shift in how seriously different countries are actually taking the question. But at the same time, when we talk about access, there's two elements to that, which is, what do we mean by the right people having the right conversations? Because if you're talking about the shift from an environment ministry to a finance ministry, that makes sense. But who is making the decisions about where money should go? Who has the best information about how money should be deployed? And there is this, I think there's a tension, especially in terms of looking at national development planning, of who is making the decisions about what should be spent where and how. And I'd like to get everyone's thoughts on that.
Could I just very briefly, so just to be clear, what I mean by that is that you need the people that have the levers to enact change to be in the conversation.
Absolutely. No, I got that. And I'm massively in support of that, because I've actually watched that shift myself, and it does make a huge difference. It's just that naturally it leads on to that next thought, because in a sense, the right people to pull the levers are a certain group. But in every group and at every level, I think when it comes to climate finance, there are different sets of the right people for different goals. Because if you want to build resilience at a very local level, is having the a national planning ministry making that decision the best choice? And I think that's the perspective I'm interested in hearing. And potentially, Jessica, I mean, because of the work you've done in adaptation, what are your thoughts on this?
I think you're right. It's good to have the right people in the room. But I think at first we need to recognize that developing countries, particularly developing countries, have come a long way in recognizing climate change and putting in place institutions to respond to climate change, both for mitigation and adaptation. And even though some countries are much more ahead than others, I think we need to kind of give it to them and say, yes, you've come quite a long way. There's very strong policies in most of these countries. There's very strong institutions. You can see the cross-institutional collaborations and mechanisms that are there. In this case, I think it's kind of, we need to focus on how to do implementation. And this is where these questions are. So how do we move away from to not just focusing on policy design or institutional design, to actually involve implementation? And you will realize that there's already institutions within these countries that can support that level of implementation, but also that need a bit more support so that they can meet the the scale of the challenge. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think here it's kind of recognizing that countries have done quite a lot. It's not aid, and if climate finance is aid, it's first of all, climate finance is not aid, but whatever it's been allocated to, it's kind of brought countries much further, but there's still much further to go.
And I think there's a really interesting question there around knowledge and access, because they are interconnected. And actually in your work in the Green Climate Fund, as Rob mentioned, there is this challenge that money can be there, but be difficult to access. So there are issues around knowledge and capacity. But I think, Krista, I'd like to bring you in on this, because I'm really interested in the private sector perspective on, what is it that you think the private sector needs to see? And what I mean by that is twofold. One of which is this issue of moving from, getting proper financial frameworks in place at a country level to encourage particular types of investment. But where is the appetite for climate bonds? You talked about, refinancing assets, but are there adaptation projects going on? Is that sort of finance happening in the climate bonds market? And if not, what do we need to do to get there?
Yeah, there is. Thank you for that. There's some, and if anybody's interested, we just published a report on this to sort of as a roadmap to get green bond issuance for adaptation and resilience investments to scale up quickly, because it is a couple of percentage points of what is already kind of too small in terms of the whole pot of money that has been mobilized. So that's been done together with us and the Global Center for Adaptation, GCA. So there's some good examples, and I just kind of want to bring this back maybe to some of the discussion points and echo what Rob, you were saying, and Felicia, you were saying about bringing the right decision makers in the room, and obviously consultative decision making and good information, but this connection between finance ministries and other, whether it's kind of trade, industrial, environment, however that country or locality or jurisdiction is structured. Sovereign bond issuance is one crucial way to do this, essentially. And I mentioned those 22 governments who've utilized this mechanism already. Some of those have adaptation related expenditures in there very clearly, such as in the case of the Netherlands, which is, they've always known that they have a problem with having to be quite prepared for extreme flooding, and now also potentially extreme sea level rise that can threaten the very existence of that country as it stands. So that has been the resounding message that we've got from governments, which is to say, in order to identify what we need to invest in, we have to bring these folks together in a room. And that can just as well happen in emerging economies or frontier economies, developing nations. We've seen Indonesia do something very similar, and that's gone down really well. To your point about investor demand and kind of mobilizing private capital, almost every green bond that gets issued that is kind of proven to be robust enough in terms of the framework that the issuer sets and says, these are the things that we want to finance, and make sure that they are derived from, science-based standards, ideally, which we don't have enough of just yet, but this is kind of why organizations like CBI exist, to help with that. But nonetheless, where that's been sort of demonstrated, they all go down really well with investors. So there's never an issue about demand. I think the overall problem with getting the money moving to emerging and frontier economies is that of general governance and institutional issues, because the way that most private investors and institutional investors investment policy guidelines are structured, they have to look for certain things that don't relate to the E in ESG. So you end up inadvertently penalizing the country that needs the money the most for what is perceived as poor governance. So we need to be able to fix that, support with these institutions, developing that kind of governance framework that you can demonstrate to say, hey, if you give me this money, I can spend it in the appropriate way and generate positive impact in my locality. And like you said, Jessica, I think blended finance is one way to do that, but we do need to have a serious conversation about what breaking down those barriers looks like just from a private finance perspective, because blended finance just isn't going to be enough at this point. So it really comes down to that same conversation that any investor would be having about what does good governance look like, in my opinion.
And I think this issue of bringing in governance, I mean, it's an incredibly important part of investment decision making, in the same way that one of the main reasons that mitigation always outstripped adaptation is because investors understood how to do mitigation more clearly, and there was a much clearer risk framework, so it was easier. But Krista, I was really interested in what you said earlier about, wanting to get rid of ESG because it wasn't helpful. Which, and I can understand where that's coming from. But the very fact is that governance is such an important part of this process. So I'd actually like to get all of the panel's viewpoints on how you see the relationship between the public and private sector finance. And do you actually think that the ESG trend is helpful to wider climate goals? And I'm going to go back to Rob and start with you.
Thanks. It's an interesting question. I think there's a whole set of issues that are very important buried within ESG. I think the question, and it would be good to get Krista's views on this, because I think that part of the question is simply, is it always helpful to bundle all of these things together in monitoring, or is it good to accept that they're different policy objectives pushing in different directions? Because one of the things that I think is quite helpful about net zero from a private sector perspective is that it's very, very measurable if you've got the right frameworks in place. And I think that's why it's been attractive. I would say that I wouldn't say that net zero has sort of attracted more than the Paris Agreement. I think net zero is a creature of the Paris Agreement, so that sets in motion the whole chain. I think what I think is quite interesting within this question, and it's getting a bit repetitive, or I'm getting a bit repetitive in talking about the intangible and linking it to the tangible, but one of the things that you have within development finance, which I think is right at the interface of this, is most of the large development banks have committed to aligning their portfolios with Paris. That makes sense at a global level because Paris has a global target, but then each of their client countries will have a different plan for getting there. And so how do you deal with the tension between a set of, and it goes to I think someone in the audience asked a question around why wasn't COP26 as ambitious as everyone wanted it to be? As long as there's a dissonance between the global goal and the national plans, it's not where we want it to be. And so I just think it's a very hard question to answer in the general, because it depends so much on the context. But I think some of the private commitments can help provide some of that pull factor to actually help attract the development of those plans. One thing I would say, though, I do think there's likely to be a trend, and I think this is one of the more substantive aspects related to the new goal. It does feel like the trend is that sometimes the best use of public finance is on upstream activities, planning and capability building, especially in a world in which you're basically trying to manage a transition rather than pay for something more expensive, i.e. due to the falling cost of renewable energy, very different for adaptation and resilience, but for renewable energy, I think that's sort of been an interesting trend. And it again goes to this question of, at the moment, we're pushing for the 100 billion, which is all about direct mobilization. And actually, is the trend in future that a lot more of the public finance is going to be on helping with those planning activities and policy formulation in order to attract private finance, rather than direct pairing and direct mobilization the way that we've historically had. But I'll leave my remarks there. Thanks.
I think that's fascinating. And actually, Ryan, I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on this, just because I think, Rob, you're right, there is a trend towards this idea that finance is better used for capacity building and facilitation. But for many countries, with smaller countries, that's a real challenge. How do you, so Ryan, what are your thoughts on that balance and the capacity building versus actually providing finance for solutions on the ground today?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And normally when you speak of climate finance, and persons would ask, what would these developing nations do with the finance when they're given these funds? And working in the government at home as well, I would have oversaw some projects like this. And capacity building, yes, it is important. But because we are already feeling such grave impacts from climate change, we need to mobilize funds to adapt and basically strengthen our become more resilient to these impacts that are being felt. Also, I think Jessica would have mentioned a while ago that these countries, every small, I'm speaking specifically to small islands, we're all at different stages in development. We're all at different stages in terms of who needs funds, who needs access to funds, and that sort of thing. So all of this has to be looked at when speaking of climate finance. But as it stands, I think we can hold up on capacity building for a bit because of how current the issues are. You know, we're feeling the impacts now, and we need to do as much as we can to adapt and continue living our lives as we would have before.
I think that's particularly interesting, actually, especially given Rob's comments about the importance of context, because I think there is a different context possibly in different countries. And that dissonance that was touched upon between global targets and individual country targets is potentially really, really important. And Krista, you are the one who sort of kick-started this part of the conversation because of your comment on ESG. What's your feeling about the relationship between the two sectors?
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have been quite as
no, I love it
with my ESG comment, but I'll clarify and then I'll get to the actual question. I think ESG is not useful in its current format, where most of the practical solutions available to investors are basically kind of business as usual plus maybe, because it's screening out the worst offenders and looking at best in class, not best in quote unquote investment universe or even in a particular investment portfolio. So what you end up with is an overweighting of governance again, and that then yields most of these investment funds being full of, especially index funds, being full of tech company stocks. That's what ESG looks like at the moment, really. So in order for it to really be additional and impactful, we need more dedicated green investors. There's usefulness in that folks are even talking about this. This wasn't the case 10 years or 15 years ago. Nobody knew what ESG was. I don't think the acronym had kind of even been born back then. It was SI or SRI or something. And then we've kind of gone through this evolution, landed here. It's useful to conceptualize, again, what good looks like. And I completely agree with your note about adaptation, not being able to identify what folks should do around that. That's definitely a barrier, but also in general ESG. So it's good that we're classifying the problems and thinking about what is useful. And especially if we take the S and start incorporating, for example, just transition issues and kind of the social impact of getting to net zero and the realities that we're going to have to change the way of life that we have, especially in the Western world, pretty drastically in order for this to work. So if we do that and put in kind of net zero and sector specific net zero pathways and strategies to get there and start identifying and assessing those as the investor community, then we are on the right track. So again, we could all work in tandem in setting those definitions, and then ideally the government regulates them. So when you're saying, again, sorry for bringing this back to the EU, but these are really the only practical examples that we have. If you say that your fund is quote unquote sustainable, there's 2 or 3 levels actually. If it's Article 9 fund, which means it's explicitly trying to generate some green impact, you have specific indicators that you're going to have to start reporting against. And if you don't comply, you have to explain why. So we start providing information also the other way of, okay, is this greenwashing or is this a really impactful fund or other type of investment solution that can help mobilize money and take it where it needs to go? That's a lot of stuff wrapped up into one, but I hope I've even touched on a little bit on the point that you made, Felicia, there.
Oh, thank you. That's great. Jessica, I was just wondering, do you have any strong feelings about the role of ESG and the relationship with climate finance in terms of adaptation? Because I think for me, I'll be blunt, I hadn't really thought about the S in terms of association with just transition. So, you know, is there a way perhaps to introduce climate justice into that area? What are your thoughts?
I also haven't thought about that. ESG and climate justice, really. I think I would need to think about that more. But my comment on this is that countries are facing more than climate change. They're facing issues that are much more diverse than climate change. And from our basic understanding of climate change is that climate change risks accentuate some of the pre-existing root causes and root problems within society, and we need to define or to design ESG in a way that enables investments to in a way address those issues. And as Krista has said, it's about how we use ESG to do that. I really don't have an answer to how we do that. I think for me, it's just recognizing the need that ESG should be held to higher standards against much more than climate change issues that we're experiencing, so that it's not it's being able to address the E, the S, and the G in it.
Thank you for that. I think there's a lot of food for thought in that. I think I'm going to sort of widen out the conversation now to some of the audience's questions. And I think one of the first questions was actually around whether or not climate finance actually just is embedding a false hope about offsets and about effective intervention in climate change. So what are your thoughts on climate finance, on net zero? Do you think it's achievable? And if, do you think the goals are achievable through climate finance and offsetting? And if so, how? And sorry, I muted myself by accident. Rob, I'm going to come back to you.
To maybe invert the question slightly in answering it. I think one thing that's fairly certain is that it's certainly not achievable without climate finance. I think having worked in a treasury, obviously not facing the levels of fiscal constraints that you see in many developing countries, and not the levels of impacts that you see in many developing countries, you still have issues of scarcity and the question of financial engineering and what pathway is most cost effective is something that that will continue to obsess finance ministries. And the role, I think, of climate finance as a concept is to show that there is an earnest desire, whether it's from the private sector, whether it's from providers of concessional climate finance, i.e. country donors largely, to support that transition. And so I think it's almost an unanswerable question, but I don't think it's right to say that climate finance creates false hope, because I think without a financing pathway, you can't really do anything, which is a very sort of bland and vanilla and not very sort of deep way of looking at it. But it's without finance, you don't get climate action. I think it's almost as simple as that. So it's a necessity. Whether it's sufficient is a different question. Thanks. I'm not sure.
I find that very useful, because I actually think this is one of the biggest challenges in having conversations about climate finance, when you do have a really broad group of different perspectives represented, which is a disconnect between this idea that finance can be used to solve a problem and the belief in the moral necessity to act on climate change. And I think that's something that I'm certainly seeing come up in some of the audience's questions. And I think it is a challenge for a lot of people working in the sector. And I think, Rob, you've been very clear. If we don't have a pathway for finance, well, that's not going to change anything. And I think part of the difficulty is, I suppose, the question of, well, okay, one of the simplest solutions is to get wealthy nations to just cut their emissions. But how do you do that Because how do you do that? And I'm not asking you to answer this question, this is more a philosophical question, but how do you do that politically? How do you do it philosophically? How do you force people to do things in different ways? And if you do have any thoughts on it, please feel free to share, but I'm just...
I think it's just an interesting, because actually most of the developed nations in sort of UNFCCC speak, and you know, we should remember that that's within the COP, that means the countries that were in the annexes to the convention, and that was it's not sort of a wealth-based criteria. Most of those nations already have net zero targets, and we're still a long way from where we need to be. So the fact is, you do need to tussle with this question of, you can't just cut emissions locally. We need global reductions. I think just one interesting point, and I'll keep it very brief because I want others to be able to come in. Just that your comments arose. I think there's an interesting question in climate finance as originally constructed. I think there's a discrepancy in how it's seen within the negotiations, where for some it is dedicated climate finance through dedicated channels, and for others it is all forms of finance that go towards climate related activities. And the fact is that in practice, we won't get where we need to be by only using those dedicated funds and channels. You need a mainstreaming. And an interesting question is where the right interaction of those things are, because actually the ultimate goal of climate finance should be to negate its own necessity, because you've constructed a sort of global system where it just happens organically. Obviously that is very unlikely to happen, and you will need to have this dedicated thing continue, but it speaks to that tension of sort of definitionally, is the sort of political imperative, does that marry up with best practice for actually making things happen? Because a lot of the best things for making things happen isn't necessarily everything being done for the Green Climate Fund, even though the Green Climate Fund is very important. It's how do you get private sector decision makers, core development banks, how do you get all of that pushing in the right direction and get the capital where it needs to go?
And that's, again, that brings up this question of materiality and credibility around targets, be they country targets or financial targets. And again, this brings back in ESG. Is it relevant? Does it work? Is it complementary? Is there a way that we can actually find ways of bringing these different approaches? Because as you say, moving beyond dedicated climate finance funds is going to be fundamentally necessary, but that doesn't mean we don't still require specific and targeted climate finance funds, you know, towards specific areas of challenge. And I think one of the questions, and I know I'm jumping around with the questions from the audience, so I do apologize, but one of the questions is actually for Ryan, which is, you know, from an anonymous attendee, but what you're just interested in what your perspective was in terms of whether or not the concerns of small island states were being heard in terms of climate finance. And I think that's interesting in itself, but also I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think climate finance expressed in a more mainstream way through ESG could be beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's a quite interesting question as well. One of the things coming out of COP26, which was a major disappointment for small island developing states, was that there wasn't much action on what is loss and damage. And that is something that we deem to be very important, because apart from finance to assist in the transition to net zero targets and assist in adaptation, we also require finance to carry on our lives as normal, because we're already feeling the impacts from extreme events. We're already feeling the impacts from rising sea levels. And I'm speaking from like personal experience here, where I will just say, working in the water sector, you know, it was quite crazy. There were times when we had to leave certain communities out of water, and we had to, I guess, you know, shut down wells because there is saltwater intrusion pending. And if we get access to finance, there are projects that I know we can mobilize these funds quite quickly for. But that's our specific, those are our specific needs. Yeah, another country's needs might be totally different. And to answer the question, Charlie, if we feel like our voices are being heard. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. And I've only attended one COP, and it was quite physically exhausting, but I could see the emotional exhaustion from the negotiators as well, because they're, like I said in my introduction, we're quite literally trying to, fight for our lives. And when you negotiate for a week or two on loss and damage, and I think the only thing that came out of it was that the conversation was started. We need access to these funds right away. So in short, I would say I don't think that our immediate needs are being met in terms of finance.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And I think, it's fairly self-evident that that is the case. It's what's difficult is working out the best pathway to changing that, because there are so many differences in opinion and experience and outlook. Krista, can I get your thoughts on this?
Sure, yeah. Similar to Rob, I just kind of want to say that it's almost a moot point in that it's not climate finance, it's we need somebody to pay for this transition. So finance is needed throughout the whole thing all the time, and lots of it. And the nice thing is that we have more money in the system than we've ever had before. And the problem is that it's more concentrated to the top 0.1% of wealth than it has ever been before. So there's a redistribution issue. And then and I get the sense of false hope maybe, and for me personally, it comes from the fact that the investment community has largely taken this kind of ESG shorthand as an interim, what feels like a cop-out, to say, I'm doing my part, but is it actually climate additional? Probably not. And we have to also recognize that there's different levels of climate investment. So there'll be investment strategies that are specifically geared towards making an impact on mitigation or adaptation right now, and then some others that might, for whom or for which it might be sufficient to just say, we're not going to do any significant harm. And some of you might recognize that that phrasing again from these taxonomy processes that abound. But in order for the kind of ESG landscape to be harnessed appropriately, and this is definitely, again, a kind of climate bonds house view, is to say, let's work out what the absolute minimum baseline to not destroy the planet from a mitigation and societal resilience perspective through an explicit climate lens looks like, and try to apply that to all of the financial system. We can do this from different perspectives. Like Rob said, the idea with that is for all finance to be green or climate related, at least to that bare minimum. And then there's these targeted interventions where probably public finance will have a larger role, and potentially also on the private sector side, if we can agree on those pathways to say, okay, are you credibly moving towards net zero? And then investors can use that. So lots of work, I think, still to do on defining those pathways and working out what it looks like for different investment strategies as well. But there's definitely room, and there's hope. Yeah, lots and lots of demand for solutions that are credible, and the ideal case would of course be for, again, governments to regulate some of that movement also from both the investor as well as the capital provider side. So banks and other financial institutions also have to have their net zero targets and show progress against that. I'll stop there for now.
So in a sense, it sort of feels like what we need to see is a complete overhaul of the financial system. We need to see financial and reporting frameworks in place that demand an understanding of impact on the climate, on the world, on society, of operations. That we need to see this in the wider financial system, and that it's the role of public finance to perhaps do those directed solutions that, Ryan is talking about the need for. How do we go about integrating those two different approaches? Because one is obviously short-term, immediate and required, but getting access to that kind of finance can be quite hard, even if it does exist in the GCF. So Jessica, do you have any thoughts on solving the entire climate finance problem, but any thoughts on how we could actually go about bringing these two different timeframes, these two different approaches together in a more effective fashion?
I honestly don't know the answer yet. So the excitement around net zero is really it's exciting. It makes me really a bit more optimistic that that there could be a chance, but then there's a need for doing this more cautiously, because the framework, and I think part of our conversations with my colleagues over the last few months as we think about net zero is that there's still quite a lot that needs to go into thinking about what net zero actually is at the different levels, what international net zero could be, or national level, or what private sector and maybe communities could do. But then the financing aspect of it is also quite important, because the 130 trillion is a really, really good opportunity. How to do that, how to bring in public sector finance and kind of leverage the private sector finance is still an area that needs to be really developed quite first to make sure that we can still tap into that while interest is still high. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that yet. I think that is part of the research that we're doing, figuring out what role does public sector have in advancing net zero goals, targets, or commitments.
Can I comment on that, Felicia, before you move on?
Please do.
Thank you. Jessica raised some really good points there. I just wanted to say, from a regulatory perspective, if we think about financial sector regulation, one really practical kind of actor in that space is central banks, and helping to make this basically an access to finance issue for those companies or other entities that are not showing progress to the effect that they should. And how you demonstrate that progress is the difficult bit, of course, that Jessica was referring to. So we have to have a pathway to get to net zero, ideally sector specific and country specific. This is hard as well, because often companies operating in, say, steel or cement or whatever, the kind of hard to abate but yet necessary activities beyond 2050 will have multinational supply and value chains. So we need that to cut across. And then working out what are eligible investments, assets, projects, activities, expenditures within that. This is where the taxonomy stuff comes into play, to say, is this particular technology going to get me onto that pathway that could be deemed credible? And if you then have, central bankers and other financial regulators taking action to say, okay, I'm demanding green collateral from my banks, but I'm also making it more costly for them to lend to, highly emissions intensive companies, for example, that aren't showing progress, then we start to see a bigger shift at the financial system level. And some of that is already happening, but it's kind of early days and it's very difficult to do without disruption. But we should also think about pricing that in now rather than waiting, because we know that every degree is going to make it exponentially more costly to mitigate and adapt to this changing climate that we live in.
I think this brings in another question that's been asked, I think, really nicely, because this issue about sectors is really important, because sectors need to understand what is specific and contextual about the different actions they need to take. The cost of capital is fundamental and one of the best ways to change the way in which people choose how to make investments. But one of the questions that's come up from the audience is how we can think holistically across sectors. So what does that actually mean in practice, and what concepts and benchmarks do we need? So Krista, you sort of started that off with this idea that central banks can set financial regulation in such a way that it is more expensive for poor performers on climate or social justice or whatever we decide it might be, that those poor performers pay more for money. But what else can we see? Sectoral benchmarking is strong, but what are the other concepts and frameworks that you all think might really add and help shift the flow of finance in a more climate-friendly, sustainable future direction? Krista, I'll come back to you because you started this.
Yeah.
Have you got anything to add?
Sure. I think it is, a lot of those kind of sector benchmarking exercises are useful to get a sense of where we are, but then there's that added piece of where we need to get to, and reconciling, what is possible within the current set of commercial realities, where there is limited stick and not enough carrot either, basically, for companies to move. But we've seen some interesting stipulations of sector-specific net zero pathways from the likes of the Transition Pathway Initiative, from the Science Based Targets Initiative, who also have their corporate net zero standard out and are working, I think, next financial institutions and then sovereign governments as well after that. So getting those into kind of the rule sets of how money is mobilized from asset owners to asset managers and then to the investee companies is potentially quite powerful. And there's, of course, an engagement piece in there as well, which we can talk about if we have time. But it's really, I think agreeing on those pathways, and then if we can legislate them, even better. But I honestly think it's going to be pretty difficult because of the multinational nature of many of those sectors.
Jessica, can I bring you in on this? What are the sorts of things you think, if we've got our magic wish list of the things we want to see that are going to change finance, what do those regulations look like to you?
I'll just go much broader, and this may not be useful. So broader than what Krista just presented here is thinking about resilience. I think resilience is a framework that encourages actors or institutions to think about different sorts of climate change risks and different actors that are relevant for responding to this risk. And so it forces us to think across sectors, across institutions, and across different levels. And I find that quite useful in, as we started off earlier, in breaking those silos, because we realize that responding to a flood requires that we think about, who imports our cars, or who constructs our roads, who grows our crops. And so that is a more cross-sectoral thinking. And it also helps us think across different time scales, which is really important, because in this case, we're bringing in the sharing of burdens and responsibilities for future generations in responding to climate change. And so, I know resilience is probably a very broad concept, but just the essential components that go into thinking about resilience as a framework could be also important in this case.
Excellent, thank you. And Rob, did you have any thoughts on this?
It's a very particular question, because I think there aren't that many levers that I think Krista hasn't already touched on that are non-sectoral in scope. I think, and I think that Jessica's points on, it's one thing to look at it from a mitigation perspective, where you've got something that's quite tangible and measurable.
Oh, Rob, I think you're breaking up.
Very hard to measure. I think that's something that, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot harder to look at something like physical risk and
I'm afraid I've lost you again. While Rob is on a loop, I think. Ryan, did you have any thoughts? I know that you mentioned that climate finance wasn't your specialist area, but you are, in a sense, here representing one of the groups, one of the countries that's really at the sharp end of the end result of a lot of this. What, are there things that you would like to see? And if so, what are they?
This is definitely not something that I would have thought of before. So, but the comments that were shared before by Krista and Jessica, I think they're really great points. Basically, I don't have anything to add, but I think it's a great take-home question for me to kind of jot down some points and see exactly what needs to be done if we were living in a perfect world.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Actually, maybe just, sorry, Felicia, maybe just one thing to add, because I think I may have misunderstood the initial question on the cross-sectoral nature. So, I mean, a lot of this comes back to policy interventions, and something that we've been looking at closely in recent months and years is kind of, how do you work out, because this comes to trade flows, right? When we're looking at global value chains and global supply chains, then we need to make sure that those are appropriately calibrated. And again, the EU, probably getting bored of this by now, but the EU is planning a carbon border adjusted mechanism, which is essentially a tax on making sure that we don't have carbon leakage from the EU to other places in the world. So you're buying stuff, bringing it from outside the EU into the EU, and then paying for that carbon because we're consuming those goods and services and potentially some raw materials within that jurisdiction. But then the production-based emissions are all kind of tagged to the country of origin's carbon budget, which is unfair. And it again perpetuates this, oh, it's the developing countries' problem. They're doing all this, you know, cheap labor-based industrial production and what have you. Well, we're the ones buying that stuff. So that's one way of starting to kind of level the playing field a little bit. And of course, contingent as well. And wish there was, you know, one silver bullet to say, let's implement a global carbon tax and just be done with it. The market will correct itself. That's not realistic, but this is kind of potentially a step in the right direction.
Great, thank you. Rob, I'm afraid we did lose you. Do you have anything to add or?
Nothing. I was just going to say really that I think that a lot of what we're, you know, by definition, finance is a cross-sectoral policy tool, and all of the tools that we're talking about here are cross-sectoral. There are just one specific point I wanted to make is that I think an actor that we haven't talked about that's really important in this space are the multilateral development banks, because they can be hubs of learning. And if you look at a lot of the early thinking that happened in refining how climate finance could be used, it came from that centralization in the climate investment funds. And they have the ability to look across countries and sectors and really reach a scale that is quite hard to do. You know, not the scale that private finance reaches, but a scale that's hard for individual donors to reach. And then the only other thing that I was going to say is just the other thing that's as cross-cutting as can be is a sort of clear signal from individual countries on the scale of their ambition and how seriously they're taking climate as an issue. Because that ultimately is the thing that signals to the private sector. But I think it's very hard to think of things that are not in the conventional financial policy and regulation toolkit that are cross-sectoral in nature. So I think it's pretty much everything that we've been talking about.
Excellent, thank you. Now we're sort of running up towards the end of our time here, and there are a number of questions which I'm afraid we haven't really been able to touch on, but I think have been addressed in different areas. So one of the questions is, you know, whether or not reporting standards for climate risk, could they contribute, or could they be contributing to the lack of balance between finance for mitigation and adaptation, and making it difficult for private finance to flow to places where data and assessment capacity is lacking. But I think to a certain extent, that is a factor again of finance rather than of climate risk per se or reporting standards, because it's about the different return. I think, you know, there are a number of questions around ensuring climate finance flows to the right people, the right, you know, the local communities, you know, getting a better understanding of redistribution issues and all of these different ideas. There are a lot of challenges around the specifics of climate finance, but I think, you know, what I'd ask is perhaps each of the panelists to sum up in one sentence what you want to see in climate finance in the next year, just the next year, in the run up to COP27. And perhaps, Rob, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll keep it quite simple. I'd like to see material progress on the pledges that have been made and to move from rhetoric to implementation.
That's great. I think clearly the implementation issue is key for a lot of this. Ryan, what would you like to see?
Like to
Sorry, Rob is in
coordination. Oh. Am I cutting out?
Yes, I'm afraid you were cutting out, so I just spoke over you, which was terribly rude. I am sorry.
That's okay. Maybe I'll come back at the end once I've listened.
Okay, but I mean, I think the key thing you talked about was implementation and actually building credibility for the targets that we already have. Yes. Yeah,
but also, sorry, but also really starting to see the growth in this more holistic discussion, and for it to begin to take form rather than just be this nebulous sort of lots of things need to happen, but to actually start to see a bit of a roadmap for a few years hence.
So it's about specifics.
Yeah.
Getting specific about solutions and how we change things. Excellent. Ryan, what are your thoughts? What would you like to see in the next year?
Yeah, put simply, I would just want to see the developed nations honor their commitments that were made in terms of the 100 billion pledge. And I would also like to see a bit more action on loss and damage at at COP27, because it was mentioned that, you know, the conversation has started. So I would like to see something concrete on that.
Excellent, thank you very much. Krista, what do you want to see?
Similarly to Rob, I would like to see all 450 financial institutions that are signatories or whatever they call themselves to the GFANZ substantiate their commitments with their own net zero targets that are science-based and front-loaded in real emissions reductions and do not rely on offsets. That's what I would like to see.
Excellent, thank you. Jessica?
Oh yeah, just putting my vote on Rob's idea. I think we just need the specifics. I'm eager to know where that finance will go. If it will all be spent in Europe, then there's a problem, and we need to figure that out quite early.
Excellent, thank you so much. Katrina, I think, has just sent round a note about the title of the briefing paper. But I think, I want to say, first of all, thank you so much to all the panelists for taking part today. It's been really fascinating listening to you. And as I said at the very beginning, it's really nice to have such different perspectives, because I think it helps us all think about things in a different way. And actually, that's one of the key things to moving forward in climate finance and in addressing climate change, is making sure we hear as many different perspectives as possible. And if I could just sum up very quickly, and I do ask you, panelists, to jump in if I miss anything major, but really what we're talking about is we have no choice but to make this work. We've got to change the way in which finance works, and we have a lot of tools and we have a lot of mechanisms. But what we need to see is a shift from a discussion about a target in the future and what we might want to the specifics of how we implement it, how we deal with it, how we make the rules work for everybody, and how we change the direction of travel. And I think that's pretty much, I mean, there's lots of ways of doing that through integration of reporting and through proving the credibility of claims. But to me, that's really what it all boils down to. Excellent. So thank you so much as well to the audience for taking part. It's been really enjoyable having your questions, and great to have you actually all taking part of it. And then finally, just wanting to say a final thank you to the UCL Public Policy Group for hosting us today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.